The God imagination is a way of seeing the story from God's perspective. It's really easy to approach Scripture as a list of principles, but we can't ignore that God begins with a story. So the story essentially presents a God who creates and judges, and everything in reality is good. And there is no element within that creation that is not good. This distinction of good is not dependent upon human action or circumstance. It's God's perspective, independent of any evidence. And the judgment is the key to unlocking a very simple way of understanding the story. The story presents this idea of what we call the tree of knowledge. And the tree of knowledge is actually this intriguing little piece of the story that we tend to not quite recognize, but I believe it's actually an essential part of the story, because what God is essentially doing is creating a way of seeing reality. God creates and it is good. God creates and it is good. God creates and it is good. And then God creates humanity and it is very good. And there's no exception to that rule. And then God places them in the garden, and then God puts this tree right in the middle of the garden, right in front of them, and says, don't eat of it. It's easy to wrestle with that, saying, God, why didn't you just put it out in the corner? You know, it's like, put it way out there where they probably wouldn't run into it. Instead, God puts it right smack dab in front of their face. And the analogy I like to use is that it's kind of like God saying, don't eat from the cookie jar, and then leaving the room while your hand is in it. You know, it's like, why does God do that? And the assumption that I made is that God continually tests us throughout the story. Why couldn't this be a test? And instead of a test of obedience, because the story eventually reveals the idea that grace was always true. Paul talks about that the grace was true from the beginning of time. If grace is true in the garden, God can get over it. Who can't? And so it's not a test of obedience per se. It's a test of reality. And if we look at the tree, it's a test with only two answers. It asks, are we good or evil? And the only way to test that reality is to encounter its opposite. If we experience evil, can we become evil? This is the inherent question embedded in the tree. And if we produce an action that is evil, does that make us evil? Or can humanity change reality through circumstance? The fundamental assumption that I make is that you can't change what is true, but you can hide what is true. And that opened the door for me to really see the problem in a very different way. That what is happening is when we construct a judgment that is different than God's and we agree to it, we actually then cover or hide our capacity to see life from God's perspective. One of the things that really helped me begin to process what I call the root problem is how we construct judgment. And with the advent of neuroscience, we're beginning to actually understand how the brain processes a sense of reality, and that we're actually biased towards seeing the judgment that already exists. So we begin with this idea that we may be good or we may not. And if we're even in a space of doubt, our brain is going to search out for information that actually coincides with that and actually ignore information that doesn't jibe with that. So when humanity actually eats the fruit, it represents the piece of evidence that suggests they actually are evil. It confronts them with this undeniable piece of evidence. How can something good produce or experience evil and still be good? As human beings, we don't have to judge, but we choose to. And if we get it right, it's all good. But if we get it wrong, it creates a false reality that actually captivates us. And so what we inevitably see is this human story of humanity getting it wrong. They get the question wrong.